What if the Song Dynasty never fell? This alternate history scenario that I just made up will be called the Xiangyang Qiji, meaning the Xiangyang miracle. In the original timeline, that is ours, in 1206, several nomadic tribes were unified under a Mongol named Temujin Aborjigin. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, I'm sure I butchered it, but he was later known as Genghis Khan, who everyone should know. Reunited, no, they were never reunited in the first place, so the newly united Mongolian state expanded rapidly and ferociously into the neighboring states. They expanded greatly into Central Asia, northern China, and later even conquered all of Persia, and this was all under one Khan's rule, Genghis Khan. This all happened in 20 or so years. But like most nomadic empires, the Khanate was very decentralized, fragmented, and unstable. The entire Khanate was basically held together by everyone's loyalty to Genghis Khan. The Khanate would manage to stay together after a few successors of Genghis Khan, but around the 6th or the 5th, the entire empire would split into four: the Il Khanate, the Chagatai Khanate, the Golden Horde, and the Yuan Dynasty. But for now, there's still one single massive entity. Genghis Khan's successor, Otogai Khan, would become Supreme Khan in 1229 after Genghis Khan dies, and he would continue on with most of his father's military campaigns. Meanwhile, in the Song Dynasty, well, should I say Southern Song Dynasty now, Emperor Li Zong ascends to the throne at 1224. He's a pretty pathetic emperor, as he left most of his duties to his advisors, as he would go out to brothels, and he would sometimes even invite prostitutes to the imperial palace. There were, I guess, some achievements during his reign. The contender Northern Jin Dynasty was destroyed under his rule, but that wasn't really his doing. He had allied with the Mongols earlier, and they together, well, I say together even though it was mostly the Mongols' work, managed to conquer and destroy the Jurchen Jin Dynasty. But, well, I don't think Li Zong really understood Mongol ethics, as he decided allying with a warmongering nation wouldn't lead to the downfall of his own nation, because right after the Jin was destroyed, he would be betrayed by the Mongols, and almost all of the Song's northern territory were forced to be ceded to them. Now, the Song Dynasty would not immediately fall to the Mongols, but they would relatively quickly, in about 50-60 years. Well, since the Mongol Empire was founded around, let's say, wait, I already said this, 1206. Well, since it was founded around 1206 and the Song Dynasty was completely subjugated around 1279, it only took about 70 or so years for the Mongols to unite China. Now, the only way I feel that the Song Dynasty would be able to withstand the Mongols would be from a miracle, and that is why the timeline is called the Xiangyang miracle. But why is it Xiangyang, you may ask? Well, Xiangyang was a major Song city back then. Much like Constantinople being a bulwark, much like Constantinople being a great obstacle to the Islamic invaders, Xiangyang, the city, was a great obstacle for the Mongol invaders, as it was a heavily fortified city controlled by the Song Dynasty, that if the Mongols had not sieged down, they would never be able to truly move their army across into the southern Song Dynasty's territory. In 1267, the Mongols would begin their siege on the city of Xiangyang. At first, the siege was actually heavily in favor of the Song, with the Song actually having built extra reinforcements around the city. These included double-layered walls, giant moats, and nets around the walls to actually capture, or at least contain, the incoming fire from Mongolian catapults. But as the years dragged on, the days dragged on, supplies ran low, and in the later stages of the siege, the Mongols, having recently conquered parts of Persia, actually no, all of Persia and parts of the Middle East, they had brought over new technologies taken from their new Arabic or Islamic, let's say Arabic for now, Arabic engineers called trebuchets. The Mongols were very fond of these large counterweight trebuchets as they had enough power to defeat the Xiangyang walls. And so they built 20 of them, and they used it all against one single city. Now, even if the trebuchets were incredibly strong, it still took a very long time to break down all of the city walls, and they weren't exactly that accurate, so many of the times they would miss the walls, landing in front of it, or even going over it and knocking over a structure inside the city. But as time went on, the Song would finally surrender the city on March 14th, 1273. This was actually due to the fact that Emperor Duzong, Li Zong, has died, so now the new emperor is Duzong. He deemed the city a lost cause. What a dumb move, am I right? As he thought the Song had no way to win against the 100,000 strong Mongol army. Oh my god, so it's 100,000 Mongolians? How are the Chinese ever gonna defeat that? Let's go back, way back. Back when Emperor Li Zong was still alive and going to brothels and inviting prostitutes over to his crib. So, well, we'll have to get rid of him, wouldn't we? Emperor Li Zong was a pathetic emperor. He really did not get anything done. Well, in this timeline, Emperor Li Zong, seeing his all of his northern territory lost to the Mongols, finally decides to get things together. And unlike in our timeline, he stops pushing duties onto others and begins to manage things himself. Well, obviously, this wouldn't make that much of a difference since he was a pretty pathetic bureaucrat, administrator as well. So, but this was a nice change of pace, you know. It signals to the people in his court that he actually cares now, and it would motivate other members of the bureaucracy to perform better. Of course, he would stop going to brothels and inviting prostitutes over. Naturally. As Li Zong would try to take responsibility for matters of state, he would obviously succumb to great stress and anxiety, and it would, I hope, of course, this is my timeline, so it does happen. Well, let's just say, I hope it finally dawns on him that, how deep in trouble the Song Dynasty really was. So after a few years of focusing on rulership, he'd once again give up managing the country and push all his duties onto his chancellors, his advisors, yada yada yada. But he still does productive stuff, just not directly for the country. He will now pursue the goal of finding a suitable heir to rebuild Song, one that could actually do something unlike him. I would also like to think, as in tradition for many Eastern emperors, he would take up poetry and art. And for art, he would begin creating propaganda posters to ignite revanchist feelings in the peasantry in China. Of course, it probably wouldn't do that much or make that much of a change, but at least he's trying. But before Li Zong will die, he will find a heir, because, if he doesn't, the Song would entirely collapse and I wouldn't have a video to make, even though this is all happening in my head anyways, but let's just go with it. He would find an heir. I don't know, let's just call him heir number 1 for now. Or, wait, hold on, let me just go find a random Chinese name generator. I'll be right back. Anyways, his heir would be called 活雪风. This young man would catch Li Zong's eyes when the emperor would ask about the results from the traditional imperial exams, the emperor, who was probably now pretty desperate for an heir since his own son died prematurely, would somehow convince Huo Shifeng to become adopted by the emperor. I imagine this wouldn't be that hard, but the hard part wouldn't be convincing Huo Shifeng to be his adopted son. It would be convincing the court that Huo Shifeng was a legitimate heir. The emperor would convince the court that, well, Huo Shifeng was born of a random prostitute he had, well, woohooed with, let's say, and he had been raising him for years, and now he finally feels that, well, he's so in-depth into his son that he has to let him become emperor. Now, this probably won't fool the court, but the court, seeing that Huo Shifeng was actually a pretty bright young man who was pretty good at administrating the country, they would just go along with it. And let's just say Huo Shifeng was actually a pretty charismatic guy, so they all like him too. Like most emperors, when HXF Huo Shifeng became emperor after Li Zong died, he would change his name. Now, I came prepared this time with a randomly generated name. He will be called Zhao Jun. And when he became emperor in December 1264, he would change his name once again, like tradition, to Zhao Xiantian, literally meaning heaven first, as he would prove himself to be a very effective ruler than his pathetic predecessor. He would manage to revitalize Song's economy and improve peasant life in China. Since he was also a peasant, he would be very compassionate and he would treat the people incredibly well. I would think that he would introduce many reforms to the Song economy, trying to improve the country's current situation. Well, if he doesn't, there wouldn't be this timeline and blah blah blah. As I have said, since he used to be a peasant, he would be very in touch with the peasant life. He'd be a pretty down-to-earth guy, so he would know what reforms would be best for the country. So I think he would introduce a bunch of reforms to the economy, e.g. relaxing state intervention in the economy and removing many of the state monopolies over special goods. He would even reform the military as well. As fear over the encroaching Mongols would dawn on him, he might even start ordering exploration missions around the neighboring nations, neighboring islands, places around China, and he might even establish a fledgling colony on Taiwan. And his new economic reforms, after a few years, I would expect, would expand the economy greatly, and this would allow him to reform the army even more. Now, at this time, the Song army, well, at least in the original timeline during this time, the Song army was incredibly weak. The generals were all very lazy, as they had nothing to gain from being a good general, as they weren't allowed their troops' loyalty and they didn't get paid enough. I said the generals were lazy earlier. One example of them being lazy would be they were all just armchair generals, and they would actually never fight with troops on a battlefield. This meant that most of their troops had very low morale and unity, as most of them might have never even seen the general before. And they wouldn't even know where their orders were coming from. And if they don't know where the orders come from, why would they trust them? So yeah, to mitigate this problem, Shifeng would encourage the generals to become more powerful and probably have a major government shakeup where he would replace many of the major generals, and to increase his image, to boost his image, he might even go and train with the troops himself in the army. And after thinking about this, I think I'll grant him, or the Song people might have called him, a nickname, and the nickname could be the People's Emperor. Hint hint, communism, communism. But as Shifeng was so nice to the peasants, I assume that the higher classes, the mandarins, the bureaucrats, may not like him as much anymore, because when the lower class loses more back in the Middle Ages, when the lower class gains more, the higher class would still gain, but they would gain less, as taxes would be lower. I mean, in the short term they would gain less, and in the long term they would gain more money. But like, people only, like politicians, we only care about short-term effects. Long-term effects, well, I'll be dead by then, so I just want my money now instead of more income in the future. I imagine that since the only thing keeping the Mongols from invading Song was the natural river dividing China in two. Well, I say river, but it's fucking gigantic. Ooh, did I just swear? Oopsie daisy. Well, I would imagine he would also expand the Song Navy. Well, it wouldn't be that hard as well. Unlike the medieval Europeans, the Song Dynasty never really needed to raise levies or train local militias, as they had their own standing army and navy. So all he had to do was just build more ships and hire sailors, as labor costs probably weren't that high back then as well. So in this timeline, as the Mongols begin their siege on Xiangyang, the siege would start off heavily in favor of the Song, and it would continue to be until, well, we already know, the Mongols bring their trebuchets. But the one difference in our timeline will be that the Emperor will not give up on the city, and he would send most of the remaining, all of the, well, at least available Song army to reinforce the city. And in this timeline, the Mongols will have less troops on the city, as the navy would be more powerful in blockading the strait and not allowing the Mongols to pass. So here is where the miracle happens. I'd say around 100,000 strong Chinese army would have to defeat the now slightly less so strong 100,000 Mongol army, and this battle will be heavily in favor of neither party, and could even be called a Pyrrhic, like the Greek thing, the Pyrrhic victory for the Chinese. But it would be enough to keep the Song Dynasty alive. So it seems like I've ran out of time, and well, both in like for the video and editing. So this will be the part 1 to my What If the Song Dynasty Never Fell video. I'll have part 2 up in a few days, maybe even just tomorrow, but yeah.